Well, I want to quickly, what we were supposed to have done last week was gone over the actual Jericho Conquest in Joshua. I want to quickly go over that today, and I want to concentrate on three things that are not often mentioned when we talk about this story of the conquest of Jericho. And then we're going to get into the story of the Gibeonites. I think we briefly touched on that last week as well. First, the three things that I want to touch on in the story of the conquest itself. Number one, the prominent role of the Ark of the Covenant. And we see that mentioned in this story, but we often don't stop to think why we see it mentioned in the story. Secondly, why are further instructions on conquering Jericho placed in the text following the command to shout to bring down the walls? If you recall the story, they marched around the city, I think, once a day for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, they marched around the city 7 times, and Joshua said, before they did that, he said, when I tell you to march around 7 times, and when I tell you to shout, then you all make noise and shout, and the walls are going to come down. That's kind of that may not be the actual words, but that's basically what he said. But when the actual text is written in Joshua, they march around the city 7 times. Joshua says, shout. And immediately following that, there's these several verses where they go through what the instructions are. Well, you would think that if Joshua said shout, the next thing that you would see would be that the people shouted and the walls came down, but that's not the way it was in the text. And then third, the saving of Rahab the prostitute. Those three things. Let's quickly get into this. Most of you know the actual story of the marching around the city for 7 days, that kind of thing, and the walls coming down. I want to look at the centrality, my commentary says, of the Ark of the Covenant. At least 10 times in chapter 6, which is where this story is found, at least 10 times in that chapter, the writer mentions the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was the symbol of the presence of God in Israelite society. It was the symbol of the presence of God. And it seems here that the writer intends for the Ark of the Covenant, and by extension, the presence of God, to be the central theme in this part of the writing. We don't often think about that. We think about marching around the city, and we think about the people shouting, we think about the walls coming down, and we agree and we understand that that was kind of a miraculous thing that happened, and it wasn't just the noise of the people that brought the walls down. You know, we understand that, but I don't know about you, but it's just kind of well, yeah, you kind of expect that in a Bible story in the Old Testament. You know, it doesn't seem like all that big of a deal. But it is. God's people, Israel, they're pretty much spectators in all of this. You ever think about that? If you'd be one of those Israelite people marching around the city 7 times and then just shouting, and then you see all of these walls just coming down and crumbling, what did you do? Well, you made some noise. Well, how did that do anything? Well, it didn't. How did marching around the city do? Well, it really didn't. You know, nothing that the people did actually caused those walls to come down, except being obedient to God. God here, I think, is demonstrating both to his people as well as anyone else who may see or hear of what happened, that he is the one who's in charge here. And he is the one that's fighting this battle, really, not Israel. And I think the 10 times or more that the ark is mentioned in this chapter, the writer is trying to get that point across. He's trying to get across the point that this is God's doing. This is the presence of God here. We know that God was very careful to make sure that his people knew just who it was who was really at work. Other times in Israel's history, God continued to remind them that it wasn't by Israel's might or it wasn't by Israel's power that they accomplished what they did, but rather it was God that was at work. For example, Gideon, you remember that story? In Judges, he had first assembled an army of, I think, 20,000 men. to fight the Midianites. But eventually, he conquered the Midianite army with, how do you remember how many people? 300. And if you remember the story, God was, if anybody who's afraid, you can go home. So a lot of them went home. Anybody who drinks water a certain way out of the stream, they can go home. They went home. He was left with 300 people. And I think that's a classic example of God saying, this isn't you that's doing this. I'm the one that's doing this. And the text actually in Judges says that. It says that it was God. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot, this is God talking, I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, my own strength has saved me. He says, you got too many men. I can't do this. You got too many. And if we do it now, you're going to say, well, we have this great army. We're the ones that did this. And God said, no, it ain't going to be that way. So I think the emphasis on the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the presence of God with Israel, is central to this story. Secondly, the reason why those further instructions were placed in there following the shout command in verse 16. As I said, one would think in this writing that as soon as Joshua told the people to shout, the next words that would be written would be an account of the action of the people, that they would shout and the walls would come down. Well, it's not the case here. The writer takes 3 verses after the command to shout. The writer takes 3 verses to remind the people what God's instructions are. First, he talks about the ban. That is, all that's in the city belongs to the Lord, and the people are to keep nothing for themselves, which, of course, one guy ignored. Then he says in these instructions, Rahab the harlot is to be saved along with all of her family. And finally, then, there's another reminder not to keep anything for themselves that's under the ban, but to put the precious metals into the treasury of the Lord. Then he records that the people shouted and blew the trumpets. Well, the general consensus here is that Joshua actually gave these instructions at a prior time, but the writer of this account, whoever that was, inserts them here intentionally in order to emphasize the commands of God over even the falling of the walls and the conquest of the city. And especially the command not to keep anything, but to turn everything over to the treasury of the Lord. Do you suspect God may have known that Achan was going to take some of the things that he shouldn't have taken? Dale Ralph Davis, the guy who wrote the commentary that I'm using, says this: by such a literary style, the writer heights the priority of obedience to God's commands over victory in and of itself. This concern pertains to us as well. We can be more taken up in preserving a mountaintop experience than in submitting to the sway of God's only begotten, Jesus Christ. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And then thirdly, the saving of Rahab. Rahab so feared God that she came to God and asked him for mercy, and God granted it to her through the Israelites. This pagan Gentile woman, you hear that? This pagan Gentile woman now stands within the circle of the people of God and forever is going to be honored as an ancestor of Jesus Christ, because she so feared God that she came to him and asked for mercy. I have to wonder if anyone else in that city would have so feared God that they too would have come to God, would he have granted them mercy? Nobody did, evidently. But my guess is that God would have somehow or another granted them mercy as well. Bringing that forward to today, if Rahab the prostitute, if King David, if the Apostle Paul, if the thief on the cross, if the woman caught in adultery, and others that you can recall could and did receive the mercy and the grace of God, what's keeping you from also receiving that mercy and that grace? We have a tough time with that. I'm sorry, but we do. We have a tough time understanding, believing, accepting, and knowing that God is ready and willing to provide grace and mercy to even us. We beat ourselves over the head. We get ourselves down. We think about how worthless we are. All of that.
You know, I was thinking about that for communion when been so long I forgot the preacher's name.
Curtis.
He was talking about Jesus washing the disciples' feet.
Right.
And I got to thinking, we've all been washed by Jesus' blood. And just as their feet were made clean, we were made clean.
Right.
And, and Peter did say, don't just wash my feet, wash all of me.
Right.
And Jesus said, well, only, you've already been washed, only your feet be clean. But I just got to thinking about that, how we've all been washed and we're all clean, but yet sometimes we still need our feet washed too, and seeking forgiveness, and that's hard to, like you say, it's hard to sometimes grasp that.
And it's not that Paul, for example, it's not that he just completely forgot about his past. He talked about his past in his writings. He talked about the fact that he was a murderer. He talked about the fact that he was against Christ and so on. He talked about all of that. But he also said that he has been granted mercy, that he's been granted grace. And we all can, should, need to think in that way. Yes, we have been those people. We have been like that in the past. But when Christ's blood washed over us, now we're clean. And God sees us as clean. He doesn't see us as we were. He sees us as we are. Okay, let's go on. Gibeon makes a deal with Israel, and Israel stuck with him. That's just kind of where that is. We're going to move forward in time. We're going to go past the conquest of Jericho, past the conquest of Ai, past the time of the sin of Achan, taking for himself those things that God has said belonged only to God. We're going to go on up to the time of the great Gibeonite deception in chapter 9. This is a survey of Joshua. This is not a verse by verse or even chapter by chapter. If you want a verse by verse, it would take probably 6 months to get through Joshua. I taught Joshua 7 or 8 years ago, verse by verse here, and it did take 6 months to go through. Maybe I go through too slow, I don't know. Chapter 9 records that while the kings of the other portions of Canaan were gathered together as one army to fight Israel, they all got together and said, let's all get together, let's put our armies together, let's have one giant army, and let's fight Israel. Now, when they talk about the kings of Canaan, they're not talking about, like you might think of, that one king had charge of thousands and thousands of square miles of land. These kings that are here were kings of cities and maybe a little bit of the surrounding area of the city. That was what they had charge of. And so when they talk about kings of certain places, it's kind of like mayors of cities, I guess, except with more authority.
I was thinking about the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And how you were saying that it wasn't the people or us. And I got to I was thinking that, and I believe, wasn't it Saul who took the Ark of the Covenant out in a battle with the Philistines, thinking that would help him? And and the Ark of the Covenant ended up in the Philistines' hands, and we all know what happened when they put him in there. But that's the thing that, that just shows how, as Christians, we do need to let God work in our lives and sometimes not try to think we know what God wants us to go on.
Yeah, and Saul kind of went his own way. He for a while he was listening to God through Samuel, but he still went his own way. I don't recall whether that incident happened after God's presence left Saul. If you recall, there was a time when God's favor or God's presence left Saul. I don't know if that was before or after, but I'd have to look at it and see.
He took it out there thinking that would help him win.
That didn't happen. It didn't happen. Yeah. The ark was not God. There was nothing magical about the ark. It was a symbol. It was a symbol of the presence of God. Well, chapter 9 records that while the kings of these other portions of Canaan, as I said, were gathering together as one army to fight Israel, the Gibeonites took a different road. They acted craftily, verse 4 says. They acted craftily, my translation says. Even though they were residents of Canaan, they took a chance and they pretended to be from a far country. Wearing old clothes, taking stale food with them, wearing worn-out sandals, they approached Joshua with a proposal. "Let us live," they said, "and we will be your servants." Let us live, and we'll be your servants. Why would they have done this? Well, they also had heard, and they told Joshua about it. They said, "We've heard about what happened in Egypt 40 years before that, how Israel was delivered from slavery in Egypt." They'd heard about that. They'd heard about the opening of the Red Sea. They'd heard about all of that. They'd heard about the two kings, Sihon and Og, on the other side of the Jordan that Israel just completely obliterated. They were very clear in their speech to Joshua that they knew that it was Jehovah God who won those battles. Chapter 9, verses 9 and 10, this is what the Gibeonites say to Joshua. "Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth." Word got around, even without the internet back in those days. This was something special. This was something different. Well, the outcome of that deception was that Joshua made a covenant, let them live and be Israel's servants. Verse 15 says, Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. But the verse right before that brings us to some error in judgment on Joshua's part. The verse before that says, "So the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord." This was something they did on their own without, however it is they do it, checking with God to see if that's what should be done. Well, Joshua finally got the picture that the Gibeonites were indeed within the promised land, and he asked them why they deceived him. And they answered him, verses 24 and 25. Here's what they said. "Because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded your servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you." They even knew what God had told Moses. How they knew, I don't know, but they knew. "Therefore, we feared greatly for our lives because of you. And we've done this thing. Now, behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us." Now, this next part is kind of interesting, I think. Joshua, it says, made them, in my translation says, hewers of wood and drawers of water. They chopped wood and fetched water. for the Israelites. It says they chopped wood, they carried water for the congregation, verse 27, and for the altar of the Lord. I had not gotten that until I studied this time. I've taught Joshua, I've read Joshua, I hadn't gotten that. Go back to the days of Noah. Noah had prophesied following the flood that Canaan would be the servant of both Shem and Japheth. Worship at the tabernacle and later in the temple required a lot of wood for sacrifices and a lot of water for washings. This wasn't something where 3 or 4 sticks of wood and a couple of gallons of water a day was sufficient. The sacrifices at the altar were for hundreds of thousands of people. There was constantly wood being burned. There was constantly water being used. Someone had to find the water and carry it to the temple or the tabernacle. Someone had to go out and find wood and chop wood and bring it in.
So they made them deacons.
Say again?
They made them deacons.
Yeah, the Gibeonites supplied the menial labor, necessary to keep the tabernacle and the temple in a good supply of both wood and water. In fact, when Solomon became king, the tabernacle and the altar were at Gibeon. 2 Chronicles 1:3. They had actually moved the tabernacle to Gibeon. Questions, comments? All right, we're going to skip ahead even further here. Completing the conquest of the land. That comes in chapter 12. Pat, am I going too fast for you?
Nope.
All right. Just asking. Okay, chapter 12 is an accounting of the conquest of the land by kings. And it names every kingdom that was conquered. I want to stop here, even though just a brief glance at this chapter reminds me of the begats in Matthew and Luke. Those are chapters that you really don't want to be called on to read aloud because of all the names. It's dry and boring material for us. Not only the begats, but this chapter 12 in Joshua as well. We can hardly pronounce the names, let alone know where these kingdoms were and how they fit into the geography of the new promised land. Doesn't make much difference to us one way or the other. There are 31 kings in all who were conquered by God through Joshua and his army. They are all named here, beginning with the 2 kings to the east of the Jordan, Sihon and Og. The list goes on with the kings of Jericho, Ai, Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, Eglon, Gezer, Deber, Gader, Hormon, Arad, Libnah, Adullam, and so on. I just put the names down there that I thought I could pronounce. Until the end of the list, which has the kings of Dor, Goyim, and Tirzah. All 31 of them are listed. The whole chapter, chapter 12. So, just as with the begats in the New Testament, what, for heaven's sake, is in this chapter for us? Why did the writer of Joshua see fit to name the kings and kingdoms one by one? Actually, he doesn't name the kings, he names the kingdoms. Why did he see fit to name them one by one and take an entire chapter to do so?
Was this any way connected before Israel asked for a king that they didn't have before to God? And then God granted that request eventually. is there some connection there that, well, they got all these kings out here, maybe this is a good idea to have a king?
It was quite some time before. All of the judges took place between this event and when they asked for a king, because they didn't ask for a king until Saul
Right.
came aboard and Samuel.
I remember the order.
Yeah, all of the judges pretty much took place. Samuel's a prophet, but a lot of people consider Samuel the last of the judges too. There were, I don't know how many judges, a dozen judges, Pat? I don't remember for sure. Something like that at different periods of time. But I wouldn't put it past God to use this as an example of, do you really want a king?
Yeah, right.
You know,
Kind
is this really what you're wanting? Okay, first we see the naming of Sihon and Og, the two kings to the east of the Jordan. These two kings are mentioned in a lot more detail in chapter 12. Chapter 12 takes 3, 4, 5 verses at the beginning to talk about these two kings especially. The writer specifically details the extent of the kingdoms of these two kings, and also says that Moses gave that land that was east of the Jordan to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. I'm thinking here that the purpose, one of the purposes anyway, was to remind Israel that these three tribes, why he took several verses to talk about Sihon and Og. I think the purpose here was to remind Israel that these three tribes are just as much a part of the promised land, just as much a part of the Israelite nation, as those who settled to the west of the Jordan in what we generally consider to be Israel, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. If you recall, there was a fear that those three tribes would not be accepted by those who settled on the west side of the Jordan. Joshua 22, if we go on ahead, tells about a particular incident following the conquest and settling of the land where the tribes on the west, the 10 tribes on the west, were going to attack those 2.5 tribes on the east, because those 2.5 tribes on the east built a second altar on their side of the river. That battle never happened, though, because God intervened and gave his approval for that second altar through Phinehas the high priest. And everything became okay then. But there was always this thing, at least up until then, well, they're not really a part of us over there. They kind of do their own thing over there. And the text then goes into this, on chapter 12, this litany of the kings destroyed by God through Israel's army. It names them by their kingdom name. And so we're going to look at this again. What is in this lineup of conquered kings for us today? This chapter is, I'm going to go back to something John Calvin said. This chapter is a living picture. This is what he said. This chapter is a living picture of the goodness of God, a complete ratification and performance of the covenant made with Abraham, as given in the words, quote, "Unto thy seed will I give this land," Genesis 7. This is a record of God fulfilling his promise made to Abraham and then to Abraham's descendants. This is what that fulfillment looks like. Chapter 12. That's what the fulfillment looks like. What's in it for us? God keeps his promises. God keeps his promises. And the second part of this is the itemizing of each of these kingdoms. Each conquest, each king that's conquered, each kingdom that's taken is an item of thanksgiving to the God who gave it. Thanksgiving and blessing are named by name in each of these kingdoms taken. With each of these kingdoms that it records being taken, we, Israel, can give thanks to God for that blessing. All right, let's kind of bring this up to today. How often have you heard in prayers the general thanksgiving when someone says, "We thank you for the many blessings of the day"? I've said that numerous times in prayers. Nothing wrong with that. But when we fail to number our blessings and give thanks for each one from time to time, we tend to become kind of blasé about it all. They quickly fade into the background of our lives, these blessings. We tend to think that we deserve them or that they're just going to keep on coming. But if we can do as the song says, count your blessings, name them one by one, count your blessings, see what God has done, then we become a lot more attuned to the work of God in our everyday lives. If you were to count and name each blessing of the day so far today, how long would it take you?
The rest of the day. The rest of the day.
The rest of the day?
You know, Jay, that list also, as you say, lets them count their blessings. But as we read on, there was still the hill country that they still had to go and try. They hadn't seeded all that land yet. But God, I was just reading where God said, "But I will clear the land for you." And so, if we, in that instance where we apply it today, if we count our blessings and we see that all God has done for us, this big long list of kings that He's, or obstacles that He's cleared the way for us, then when we look at other obstacles in our life, if we just keep that same faith, God will clear those obstacles for us also, if it's His will. So that's also something that it would give them hope when they would go.
Right. I've done all of this for you. There's no reason to think that I'm not going to help you finish this job.
Right, and that's something we can apply today.
Yeah. Or I said that wrong. There's no reason why I'm not going to finish this job on your behalf, because it's God doing all of this.
It all works in progress.
Israel was reminded in this chapter of the blessings of God as they thought about each of these kings when they read through this, named in this part of Joshua, these kingdoms. They may have heard stories told by their ancestors who were part of the conquering army that defeated these kings. Now I'm talking about generations after this when they read this. This chapter is not one of boredom. It's not one of tedium. This is a chapter of thanksgiving, of blessing, and praise to the God who keeps His promises. And we're going to go ahead and end on that. Questions, comments? And Aileen, I'm glad that you will take the rest of the day to count your blessings. And truly, and I'm not making light of that, because if we really stop and think, if we clear our minds and then really stop and think about the blessings of the day, and if we name them just one by one, I don't know if it's going to take the rest of the day, but it's going to take a good share of time for us to do that. There's so much involved in that. There's so much of the blessings of the day that we tend to take for granted. And I don't know, we have lives to live, and we have things to do, and we have places to go and people to see, and I don't know that God expects us to take all day, every day, just to count our blessings. But from time to time, we need to take some time off, I think, and at least make an attempt to do that.
Stop and smell the roses, right? Stop and smell the roses.
Yes.
I think it's important each day as we live to acknowledge God's blessings. Now, it's a small thing, but when God gives me a green light and I'm in a hurry, it just seems each day and stop whatever we're doing and thank Him. You don't have to stop what you're doing. You just say, thank you, Lord. I acknowledge your blessing.
There are people that poo-poo the idea of God giving people, I don't know, good parking spaces and green lights and all of that. And, you know, there are people that think, well, God just works in our lives in the big things. The little things are chance. The little things are just circumstance and so on. I don't know, Ann, whether I have no idea. I don't know.
I think He cares about us.
But I'm not, yeah, I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise. If you believe in that God provides green lights, at times, I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise of that. It's not my job to do that because I don't know. I have no idea. And if it's because I might believe otherwise.
I think He also provides other people speeding on the highway so you don't get tickets. You go by and see highway patrol pulled over someone.
Well,
I'll stop.
I don't know about that for sure, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know, and Aileen could very easily, I think, count blessings. One of them sitting beside her, and you know, I don't know how often you count that blessing, Aileen, but
Often.
or how much of a blessing he is all of the time, but. Okay, thank you so much. We will continue with this. We're going to talk about Caleb and his request. I think that has to do with the hill country, if I remember right. And we'll talk about that next week. Thank you.